Welcome. This is our third week of exploring the Christian library. We began with an overview of the 27 books. Then last week we considered the 9 signature events described in the Acts of the Apostles, which clearly established the uniqueness of the Christian movement as it sort of crawled out of the cradle of the Christian community and became a faith movement focused on following Jesus, as Gentiles were welcomed into the community of faith. In Peter's words, Gentiles um, as well as Jews were welcome because Gentiles are saved by grace, not by the rites, rites, of humankind, namely circumcision. Let me say that again. Peter's message was that Gentiles, as Jews, are saved by grace, not by the rites, rites, of humankind. Now, as we start our exploration of the books in the Christian library, it becomes clear that the identity of the Jesus movement was clearly established before any of the 4 Gospels were written: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The identity of the Christian movement was already created. How was this identity established? Through the personal and faithful leadership of the man named Paul. He was not a disciple of Jesus. He was an apostle sent by the early Christian community to proclaim the good news to both the Jewish and Gentile world. An apostle sent to the world. Now, Paul didn't set out to define the Jesus movement. His passion was for the movement to reflect the teachings of Jesus that were shared orally within the Christian movement. The book of Acts traces Paul's visit to these early faith communities in Galatia, Ephesus, Corinth, Thessalonica, and Philippi, they were passionate about being faithful followers of Jesus over against the culture of the day, dominated by Grecian thought that had no reference to the spiritual, the politics of the Roman Empire that wanted to extinguish any faithful community. Paul's letters to these churches and these followers of Jesus amidst this culture were written between 50 and 60 AD. Paul's letter to the faithful in Rome was the only letter he wrote to a community of faith that he had not previously committed and visited it. And so all of the rest of Paul's letters to the churches were written following a visit. He knew the problems, he addressed the problems, not to Rome. His letter to Rome was sort of a culmination of his thought, introducing himself to the followers of Jesus in Rome. Now, these letters of Paul formed the early identity of the Jesus movement. Again, written prior to any other books in the New Testament and the Christian library. And following is the primary components of the early Jesus movement, including the reference of the church that Paul addressed the letter to. Now, this list that I've created out of Paul's letters to the churches is not intended to be exhaustive, but rather to simply represent how the content of these books in the Christian library developed the early identity of the Christian movement before any other books were written. So let me just list these components, representative of the characteristics of life in the early Christian movement. How do we know this? Through the letters of Paul, written to the churches. First of all, followers of Jesus are God's temples. Why is this important? The presence of God is not to be experienced in buildings such as the temple. Rather, the presence of God is experienced in the human lives of the followers of Jesus. Where do we know this? 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter. Secondly, followers of Jesus gather in a community of faith to celebrate the Lord's Supper, a joyous celebration of the good news of forgiveness. How do we know this? 1 Corinthians 11. Thirdly, followers of Jesus are governed by agape love, the attitude of empathy and sacrifice in servanthood of others. How do we know this? 1 Corinthians 13, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Fourth, the followers of Jesus are cheerful givers. Don't give out of obligation. Don't give out of law. Rather, giving is given out of an attitude of joy. How do we know this? 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter. Fifth, followers of Jesus experience freedom not as a release from bondage, but as a challenge to love without any guardrails. Love one another. Found in Galatians 5. Sixth, the followers of Jesus participate in a community of forgiveness. Forgiven followers forgiving each other. Say that again. Forgiven followers forgiving each others. Colossians 3, Ephesians 4. Next, followers of Jesus participate in a community of humility. Never to look down upon others in judgment. Following Jesus, who to his death humbled himself. Philippians, the 2nd chapter. Finally, followers of Jesus participate in a community of thanksgiving. 1 Thessalonians, 2nd chapter. You see, as we read and study Paul's letters to the emerging communities who follow Jesus, we are experiencing the birth of one of the 3 major religions of the Western world. This took place in a world marked by cultural immorality, and political abuse and corruption. The odds were against the survival of this movement, but rather than survival by any measurement, the movement thrived instead of just surviving because it was rooted in the revelation of divine love in the rabbi named Jesus. Present at the beginning was a man named Paul, warts and all, who formed the values of the early Christian community that we cherish 2,000 years later. Why? All because of the formation that took place as a consequence of the earliest books in our Christian library, Paul's letters to the churches. Now, that's a short book review of a lot of books. But for your thought and our conversation, what's your response to the understanding of the author of Acts that the apostles and many historians that Paul was the catalyst of the Jesus movement as it became the primary community of faith in the Western world? Which of these characteristics, thanksgiving, humility, forgiveness, freedom, cheerful giving, agape love, the Lord's Supper, and being the temples of God, are marks of your Christian community today? And finally, which of these characteristics are not present in your Christian community today? Thanks for another trip that we've taken into the origination of the Christian library, Paul's letters to the churches. Thanks for being a part of our journey.